So here's the message you've been waiting for, guys. Week 5 of Keep the Faith.
Well, hey there, Elevate family and friends. Great to have you with us today for week 5 of our series, Keep the Faith. And what we're doing in this series is we're taking a flyover of some of the great heroes of faith throughout early recorded history. In fact, a list was compiled by the writer of a letter called Hebrews, which you can find in the new part of the Bible, the New Testament, specifically in chapter 11. And those people that this writer refers to, has gathered in this list, have sort of been dubbed the Hall of Faith. And so if you missed any of the previous 4 weeks, then I strongly encourage you to go back and watch them either on this platform or you can listen to them on our podcast. Just grab your favorite podcast app, search Elevate Church Perth. We'll be there and you can catch up on those. Now, speaking of your phone, your apps, if you've got your camera ready, how about you scan this flow code, and it's actually going to take you to this chapter, this Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith chapter. And today I want to drop us into some of what we can learn from a guy named Moses. Now, right off the bat, the first thing the writer of Hebrews double clicks on when it comes to Moses' life and what mattered in Moses' life was actually not Moses' faith, but rather the faith of his parents. That Moses' journey was very much kick-started by the faith of his parents. See, the context was when Moses was born was that the Israelites, which Moses' family were a part of, were actually slaves in Egypt. And the Israelites were growing in numbers, and the Egyptian Pharaoh started to see them as a threat, that as their population grew, they may actually turn on him. So he issued a decree that all male baby boys, when they're born, be rounded up and thrown into the Nile River to be drowned at birth. Simple logic from an evil Pharaoh's perspective: reduce the population, reduce the threat. So this was the setting that Moses was born into. And the writer of this letter to the Hebrews highlights this, that it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child. Some other translations talk about an extraordinary child. And they were not afraid to disobey the king's commands. So before we get into what Moses ultimately went on to accomplish, it's vital, and the writer of Hebrews jumpstarts this by underscoring that none of what Moses went on to accomplish would have even been possible were it not first for his parents' faith and their obedience to God in this situation. And listen, there's a lot we could talk about, the importance of parents' faith and living by faith and demonstrating faith, not just a belief in God, but acting and taking risks and doing what's sometimes inconvenient and uncomfortable and unpopular. But we don't have time to go into that today. I would encourage you, those of you who are parents, just to let that simmer and ask yourself the question about your faith, not just for you, but the generations to come. Anyway, after 3 months, for whatever reason, I guess he was growing, obviously, Moses' parents felt they could no longer hide him. So what they did was they actually crafted a little basket and they put the baby in it and they put him into the river, hoping that he'd be rescued and that he'd ultimately, things would be better. And this to me is remarkable, that his parents put him into the very river that the evil Pharaoh had decreed that baby boys ought to be thrown into. Hebrew baby boys. This is a reminder that what the enemy meant for evil, God can turn around for good. What the enemy maybe uses as a tool to thwart God's plans and purposes, God can actually use that very same tool to accomplish his plans and purposes. And that could be your history, your story, your experiences, things people have said about, whatever. Anything that the devil's come at you with, God can actually use that very, very same thing and turn it around and use it for his good. Well, it may not have been a coincidence, we don't know, but it was actually Pharaoh's daughter who came across this baby boy that ultimately was Moses. And then the obvious thing happened is that, there's no grocery stores in the area selling infant formula. And so Pharaoh's daughter summoned for a wet nurse. And what she didn't know is that the person that they found was actually Moses' biological mother. I just said what the enemy meant for evil, God can use the very same thing for good. Now Moses' mother, who had taken this enormous step of faith, first to hide him for 3 months and now to actually set him into this river and pray that God would do something great, she actually was reunited with her son, was able to care for her son, and now she was getting paid to do it by the very people who decreed that this son ought to have been killed. Yeah, so good. Moses ultimately lived 120 years, and big brain Bible scholars essentially break down his 120-year life journey into 3 40-year phases, or what the Swifties like to call eras. The first 40-year era, he lived as a prince in Egypt. The second 40-year era, he lived as a shepherd in Midian. The final 40 years, he lived as a leader of Israel. In fact, one of these very same big brain Bible scholars, a guy named D.L. Moody, he actually says it this way, that Moses spent the first 40 years thinking he was a somebody. He spent the second 40 years learning he was a nobody. And then he spent his third 40 years discovering what God can do through a nobody. And so as we journey through Moses' life, and we're not going to be able to get into it all today, there's a lot to cover off, but one of the things we learn from Moses' life is how to lead by faith. And just as the motivation for this series is about the fact that our faith isn't fixed or doesn't have to be fixed, that our faith is something that can grow, the same is true for our leadership effectiveness, our leadership capacity, that our leadership capacity and effectiveness doesn't have to be fixed, that we can learn how to grow in capacity and effectiveness as leaders. One of the very critical things that we can learn from Moses' life and leadership is that one of his superpowers was his ability to make choices that weren't always popular, weren't always convenient, and in fact, what they were was filtered through the lens of God's plans and purposes. Much like his parents made choices when Moses was born, not through what was popular or what was convenient, but first and foremost through God's plans and purposes. Now, 500 years ago when I was at school, it was common practice when it came to school sports or physical education class for the teacher to pick, to have teams compete against each other. The process was they would pick 2 people, one to be a captain of each team. Typically they were the jocks. And then those captains got to choose their team members. You know, first I'll take him, then I'll take her, then I'll take him, then I'll take her, and this went on and on and on. And it was kind of cruel because the people that got picked last were the people that weren't very good at that. That's why they got picked last. And they were reminded in front of everybody that they weren't very good at that. I hope that practice has been kind of banned now. It was humiliating. But the good news is, actually, in life, unlike my time in school sports, you actually can choose which team you want to be on in your life. See, Moses actually got to a point in his life where he was at a crossroads and he had to choose which team he was going to be on, and the choice he made would have appeared incredibly contrarian. Because at this crossroads, Moses was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was smart, rich, and powerful. He was a prince in Egypt and likely the successor to Pharaoh's throne. And yet, at this crossroads, he discovered that he was a Hebrew, that he was actually born an Israelite. The very people who were living as slaves in Egypt under the rule and the control of the Pharaoh, and he started to identify and resonate with the suffering of the Israelites, the suffering of his people, and he felt God calling him, rather than to take over from Pharaoh, he felt God calling him to a different destiny. And the writer of the letter to Hebrews recorded it this way: it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. Now, on the surface, this would have looked like Moses was choosing to leave the winning team and voluntarily join the losing team, which would have made no sense. But here's the reality: Moses ran this decision through the filter of God's plans and purposes, not what was popular, not what was convenience, but what would require faith and courage, but what would be worth it, because this is God's plans and purposes, and they were his priority. You know, I remember when I was 26 years old, sitting down with my parents at the time, and I told them that I was going to leave my job and go to Bible college full time. This was shocking to them. That's an understatement. See, because my parents were born either side of World War II and were both raised in the aftermath of World War II. And the prevailing mindset and the prevailing pathway of their generation was that everyone ought to go to school, get a job after school, and retire when you're 65, and have prioritized security throughout that entire multi-decade journey. Now, add to that, my parents both worked hard to put my brother and I through school. In fact, when we were in high school, my dad took on a second job to allow them to be able to afford to send us to a private school. They weren't people of very financial means. And then I'd gone on to university, and then I'd got a corporate job, and I was working at the age of 26 for the third largest company in the world, and I was moving steadily up the corporate ladder. And it was everything that my parents had worked and sacrificed and hoped and dreamed for me. And yet here I was, age 26, sitting down with them saying I'm quitting that and I'm going to go to Bible college. To which my father asked a very reasonable question. what are you going to do after Bible college? And I gave them the honest answer, but I can categorically say it wasn't very reassuring to them. I said, I don't know. I just know that God's calling me to take this next step. It's not popular. It's not convenient. It doesn't even necessarily make a whole lot of sense. I get it, but I've got to do it. So here's a question. Is there a next step that God's calling you and been calling you to take that you haven't taken yet because it doesn't make complete sense, that it doesn't seem popular, that it won't be convenient? Things like cost of living's increasing, so giving to God's church makes no sense, and yet God calls us to do it anyway. Everyone's busy. We're busy. Everyone's busy. So serving in God's church, actually investing hours of your week and month and year, investing into God's church, it makes no sense. If you've been through some wonkiness in your life, dysfunctional past, things have happened to you, you've got scars to prove it, stepping up to join a team and maybe lead an Elevate group, none of that makes sense. But making sense isn't the primary filter that Moses gives us the example to use. The primary filter that Moses gives us to use is this God's plan and purpose? Because if it is, then despite it making no sense on the surface, the only thing that makes sense is to take that next step. And this is what I can assure you, and this is exactly what happened to Moses, and this is exactly what's happened to me in the coming up 3 decades since I took that next step. It sets you on a wild and great adventure. A couple of years ago, my wife, who's an educator, scooped up our then 6-year-old nephew. He was on school holidays, and they were going to spend the day together. And the start of the day, they were here at our house. And I said to my nephew, hey, what are you going to be doing this afternoon with your Zia? Zia is auntie in Italian. My wife is Italian. And he said, oh, we're going on an adventure. And I said to him, wow, that sounds great. What's involved with this adventure? And he said, I don't know, but I'm excited. And I was like, okay, yeah, our 6-year-old nephew, he got it. He didn't need to know where he was being taken. He didn't know what was going to be happening. He just knew that he trusted his Zia, and he knew that whatever the adventure was that his Zia was going to take him on, whilst it was going to be full of unknowns, that it was ultimately going to be great and worthwhile. So he just obediently went along with the plan, even though he didn't know the plan. One of the problems is that too many people want to know the whole plot before they decide whether they're going to go on the adventure. They want to know who lives, who dies, how much sacrifice is involved, how long is it going to take. Moses didn't actually know what the adventure was going to look like when he first decided to leave the palace. He simply trusted that God was calling him to a different destiny, and that destiny was going to be good and worthwhile. Not always comfortable, not always popular, but he put God's plans and purposes first. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, and he kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. The choice made no sense. The choice to leave the palace and embrace the pain of his people made no sense. And it would have continued to make less and less sense because after his 40-year era of living in the palace as a prince in Egypt, he spent the next 40 years living in Midian, living in the desert, swapping a palace for a tent. But one of the things we need to understand is God isn't actually calling us to a life of perpetual ease. Oh, really? Yeah, really. He's calling us to put his plans and purposes first, and it's going to be like a roller coaster, but it's going to be an adventure. And he's got a great reward waiting for us, just like he did for Moses. A number of years ago, I was in Verona, the city of Verona in northern Italy, famous for Romeo and Juliet, among other things. And I was there, a church had invited me to teach a leadership seminar, an evening leadership seminar for team members. Not only for their church, they actually invited team members and leaders from churches across the north of Italy. And it was midweek. I think it was a Monday night seminar. And so being hosted in Verona, people from churches were coming from Milan, Florence, and all these so-called exotic cities that real people live in, not just tourists. And the thing started at 8 p.m. And it started at 8 p.m. because people that were coming from Milan and Florence, a 2 to 3 hour drive away, had to finish work, get in their cars, and make the trip across. So it started at 8 p.m., finished at 10 p.m. Then there was Italian festivities, biscuits and espresso coffee. And so some of these people didn't get back in their vehicles to midnight and after midnight. And then they made the 2 to 3 hour drive, those that came from Milan and Florence and so on, back home, then to have to go to work the next day. And I said to my friend Mauro in Verona, who was hosting this seminar, this makes no sense to me. These people, this makes no sense to me. The timeline and the travel, a 4 to 6 hour round trip, it's a weeknight. And Mauro said to me, Marco, you need to understand something. This is Italy. This is the epicenter of Catholicism. Every one of these people would have been born into a Catholic family. And every one of these people had their own personal encounter with Jesus and chose to leave the Catholic Church, the seeming winning team in Italy, and join a small startup evangelical church. And they would have been ridiculed by their family and friends. They would have been accused of sort of treasonous behavior. Aren't we good enough for you? This faith, this Catholic Church was good enough for your grandparents and your great-grandparents. And he said to me, they chose to leave all of that to experience all of the persecution and the ridicule and the shame that was being foisted on them because of Jesus, because of the call to reach people and build people for Jesus. These people are all in. These people are placing God's plans and purposes ahead of their own popularity and convenience. Okay, Mauro, you got me. Incredibly inspiring and incredibly challenging. Now, final word. it's important to understand that while God will call us to take risks, there's a difference between risks and being reckless. Taking risks and being reckless. A number of years ago, I was in Palm Springs teaching at a church leadership workshop there, and during one of the afternoons we had the free time, and so we went golfing. And so I'm golfing with the friend of mine, Tom, who was leading the church that was hosting this conference, and we're golfing in Palm Springs. Now, if you haven't been to Palm Springs, don't let the name fool you. Palm Springs. It's in the desert, okay? It's in the desert. Like Midian, it's in the desert. Now, whilst they pour countless gallons of water on the fairways and the greens, and they're lush and they're manicured, they don't touch the rough, the parts either side of the fairways on the golf course. So my friend Tom, he teed off, hit his ball, and it went left off the fairway into the rough. And so we're walking along and, getting close to the point where his ball went into towards the rough, and I see this sign. Yep. Beware of rattlesnakes. And I'm thinking to myself, now it wasn't my ball that was in there, but I'm thinking to myself, there is no golf ball in the world worth enough money that would cause me to go in there, to go looking for it, to try and pick it up, hit it out, whatever. Because I would have considered that to be reckless. Yet my friend Tom, who, okay, he's from the area, but still, he just grabs the golf club that he was going to use, walks into the rough, and I'm like, Tom, what are you doing? And he's like, it's going to be okay. I've got my golf club. And I'm like, as much as I love my friend Tom, this falls squarely into the reckless category. So that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about situations where it's going to take faith and courage to do the thing that God's calling you to do. It's not going to be always popular. It's not always going to be convenient. It's not always going to make sense to you, or it's not always going to make sense to the people around you, but it's always coupled with the promise of a great reward. And we'll only experience that if we keep our eyes fixed on the one who is invisible, just like Moses did, and take the next step, the risky, inconvenient, unpopular next step. Or live insulated and miss out. Now, in the words of the late great Steve Jobs, one more thing, grab your phone camera, scan this, because every single week we're putting up a featured Bible plan in the Bible app. This is going to allow you to access that feature every week on the Hall of Faith member that we've been learning about. So this week, we'll be putting up a featured Bible plan in the Bible app about Moses, so we can learn more, grow more in our faith and in our leadership. Now, we are continuing this series next week. I feel like we're just getting warmed up. There's a lot of people in the Hall of Faith, and we can learn a lot of stuff from them. So that's what we're going to do. So we'd love to see you back here next week. Invite someone, host a watch party, whatever it takes. See you then.